Thank you very much, David. So, David did a fabulous job with the introduction, and one of the things you might have picked up on the introduction about Colin was his traveling, and he is a very accomplished traveler. But my understanding of Colin's background is that his interest in the oceans started many, many miles away, in fact, in the middle of Hungary. So maybe I could just ask Colin just to explain how we connect Hungary with the oceans.
Yeah, it's ironic, isn't it, to be from Maine and yet get involved in global oceans reporting through being in landlocked Hungary. But it is indeed how it came about. I was based in Eastern Europe, during and for years after the collapse of communism. And I ended up being a journalist based there. And there was a lot going on, obviously. There were, ethnic tensions and ultimately wars and carpetbaggers coming in and remaking the economy from both East and West, and a ton of stuff to report. But I found, oddly enough, that much of what I ended up reporting ended up being environmental in nature. And this was because the environmental problems in the region were so ridiculously profound. I mean, these weren't peripheral issues. If you ever want to wonder, what would the world have been like without the Clean Air and the Clean Water Act, go back and look at the, Newsweek and Time and New York Times photos from Eastern Europe after the collapse of, places, towns and cities that are completely black, the people, the trees, the buildings, the window panes, because the local carbon black factory just sends all of their emissions straight up and they just fall back down the town. Everything was like that. The various end products of the human endeavor were just dumped into the environment, into ditches, into rivers, and so on and so forth. And the effect of that by 1989 and 1990 was really quite disturbing. I remember being in various towns in the Czech Republic and Albania and stuff where you'd be, walking along some beautiful medieval setting in the middle of an old town and walk into a dip across a bridge, and as you headed into the dip, you almost passed out and were choking from some weird industrial stuff that had been released. So I ended up covering that stuff because it was front and center and a major problem. And because I was based in Budapest, inevitably ended up covering the Danube River. Because any of you have visited Budapest, the Danube flows right through the middle of the city with all the sweeping bridges, and everything in Hungary is named after the Danube, be it the local television station all the way through to the frequent flyer program of the now defunct airline. And the Danube was profoundly polluted. And it was also a fantastic metaphor for the big meta story that we were all in Eastern Europe covering, which was, that history, the great deep freeze of history, had ended and everything was thawing out, and some of the historical grievances and national frustrations and tensions were rapidly coming unthawed and would lead to some of the wars that we'd end up covering later. And the Danube connected all of this region, an entire watershed. A 1,500-mile-long river that starts in Switzerland and connected east and west and swept through with its tributaries to absorb a dozen countries, and all of the end products of the human endeavor I mentioned, whether it had been dumped into a ditch or into the river system and into a stream, was ending up in the Danube. It was kind of the grand sluice way for all of that stuff. And it was pretty bad, because imagine, once you got south of Vienna in the Danube, and the Danube runs down through Budapest and runs through, down and through Serbia and then across Romania. And all of the sewer in Budapest, which was a city of 2.5 million, ran into the Danube with only secondary treatment, which meant basically it was run through screens before it hit the river. And all of the sewerage in Belgrade, which is 2 million people, and in Bucharest, which is 2.5 million people, and in Bratislava, which is 750,000. In fact, virtually every single community of any size, the entire lower watershed encompassing a half dozen countries, was ending up in the river untreated. And so were all of the runoff from the agricultural system. And the Soviets, you had unlimited inputs of cheap chemical fertilizers from the Soviet Union under the Comecon system. So it didn't matter how much fertilizer you used, so you would use lots and lots. And there was the only markers by which economic activity were measured were on productivity and whether or not you met a 5-year plan. So you tried to produce as much of everything as you could. So you would saw down every last tree to the riverbank and plant right to there, and of course everything would kind of slough off on a road. So terrible, terrible pollution was flowing in there, along with oil and all the substances and radioactive debris and toxic stuff that was being pumped into the system. Hey, great story, right? And we all congratulated ourselves as we wrote about this story that we were thinking broadly and we were giving people the big wide perspective and really catching the context. But oddly enough, none of us, and tons of us were writing this story, ever asked the rather obvious question: where does all of this stuff carried by the Danube go? And the answer is that it all flows all the way down through Romania and ends up in the Black Sea, which is a semi-enclosed sea about the size of California, with only one exit through the Straits of Marmara where Istanbul is, and doesn't have a lot of circulation. And in the early 1990s, we became painfully aware of this fact because the Black Sea underwent a sudden, unexpected, and really catastrophic biochemical catastrophe as a result. And the driver of this catastrophe wasn't the oil and the radioactivity and the toxics that you usually think of, or that people did at that time think of. It was something that doesn't even sound that bad. It was nutrient pollution, which was kind of hard, at least at that time period, to get people upset about. But all of this sewerage and fertilizers were all ending up down in the Black Sea. And it turned out that the governments had been building dams and had been removing wetlands throughout the system, which was making the problem worse. And it seems the final blow may have been when the mad dictator Nicolae Ceausescu decided he was going to increase the productivity and greatness of the Romanian people by draining the Danube Delta, one of the world's greatest wetlands, vast like the Mississippi Delta country south of New Orleans, to make way for rice production, which actually didn't work. But it did remove some of the final filters of plant life and stuff that would have drawn and removed some of these nutrients before they hit the Black Sea. And in the early 1990s, the levels of nutrients going in the Black Sea exploded. And the result was not unlike in a main lake where things have gone bad and people didn't stop pumping their camp's sewage into the little pond, and finally you get a giant algae bloom, and the whole lake turns dead. That kind of happened to the whole Black Sea system. Basically, you got so many nutrients going into the system that it provoked and fertilized the water. Now, we usually, we're used to as land inhabitants thinking of, plants as being large things. Well, in the oceans, the plants at the base of the food chain are generally microscopic. I mean, yeah, they're seaweeds and stuff, but the vast majority is out floating there, and you can't really see it in algal form. And it basically has everything it needs to live out there in the oceans, except nitrogen and phosphorus. Some of these the limiting factor on their growth often is the amount of nutrients available. And suddenly there are all these nutrients, and they just exploded to form huge mats over dozens and dozens of square miles of the sea. Mats so thick that light could no longer penetrate to the bottom. And all of the plant life and the seaweeds and structure on the bottom that things lived in was wiped out because it no longer had any light to photosynthesize. And there was so much of it being produced that it outstripped the ability of all the little creatures that go around eating algae to eat it down. So generation and layer upon layer of dead algal mats was falling to the bottom. Now what happens in a marine environment if nothing eats that down is it all gets eaten and done away with bacteria. Hey, great, except the process the bacteria use to do that requires that they consume and strip out all the dissolved oxygen around them in the water column. Now remember, fish have gills, and because they're breathing the dissolved oxygen, they actually do breathe, and suddenly that wasn't available over vast areas. So on the bottom, anything that couldn't escape these growing oxygenless dead zones died. And anything that was trying to get to some place to breed or to spawn or to hatch or to go feed on something that it expected this time of year wasn't able to get there. Everything was thrown into pandemonium. Now this is a story and a metaphor for problems encountered elsewhere in the ocean because several factors that we as humans deal with and manage completely differently in our activities with the oceans interacted to create a massive disaster, which any one of these strands wouldn't have done on their own. But we as humans don't think about agriculture in Hungary or Slovakia, which are hundreds and hundreds of miles from any ocean, somehow affecting the sea. And especially how it might interact with, say, the policies of navigation companies in their ballast water. And in this case, that's exactly what happened. Ships going across the ocean, you probably notice when they pull into port here in Portland, that when the oil tankers empty out, they rise up. You can see the numbers, 10, 15, of how much they've risen out of the water as they pump the oil out and they weigh less. Well, to get across the ocean again, they often have to pump some kind of ballast back in because if they're riding that high up in the water, it's not that safe if they're running back empty. So they tend to pump seawater back in. Hey, great, right? And then you can pump it back out when you get to the other port. Except that some of the little organisms and things and eggs and such that you pumped in one harbor sometimes survive the trip in the tanks until you reach the other end of the world and pump them out again. And most of the time they die because the environment isn't suitable, but sometimes they go crazy. And this is what happened in the Black Sea when a passing freight vessel of some sort who'd been on the east coast of the United States pumped out a North American little tiny organism, a comb jelly, a jellyfish-like creature about yay big, pumped maybe one of those, maybe a few, a handful, out into the Black Sea. But they pumped it out at a time when the Black Sea ecosystem was all in disarray from this explosion in nutrients and all these algal mats. And they didn't encounter any predators, and they went crazy. It was one of the most phenomenal explosions of any organism that we've ever recorded. It went from, maybe one little comb jelly weighing a few grams in a few short years to 1 billion tons of biomass of this. Which, how much is 1 billion tons? 1 billion tons is equivalent to all of the fish caught by all the world's fishermen in a year. It was an incredible and staggering explosion. And it turns out that they eat all of the zooplankton and microorganisms that would normally eat down the algae, making the problem even worse. And by the end of it, almost every fish species you could imagine had collapsed because they also like to eat their eggs, to the point where finally you just had a sea that was mats of slime and jelly. Well, it was a pretty stunning experience, particularly since nobody was expecting it coming. And you just destroyed a sea that had provided sustenance to civilization since ancient antiquity, and now it was suddenly gone. And all through geochemical processes that nobody even thought about. All these unseen organisms. So one of the things that intrigues me about the work that Bigelow does, and he's always got me interested in it, is you guys study those very microbes and their processes, all these things that we don't see. And I guess my question to you, Graham, is why is that important that we study and understand these things in today's context?
Well, thanks, Colin. So, I think that Black Sea example, if we kind of extrapolate that to the world's oceans, we suddenly have to change our perspective that the ocean vastness that we've so been accustomed to is now under significant pressure and change from activities of humans and the climate and the world around us. So at Bigelow, we recognize that these microscopic organisms that Colin is talking about, whether they come about through explosions of large amounts of nutrients arriving from the rivers, or whether it's the natural populations that are there, these are really important to the health of the oceans. And we'll come on later to talk about what that actually means in practice and how do we manage the health of the oceans and how do we recognize whether an ocean is healthy. But to get to that point, we need to know about these organisms. We need to know about the viruses that infect the bacteria and how the bacteria themselves degrade the phytoplankton that Colin's talking about, how the phytoplankton, which are the microscopic plants, are the foodstuff for the next level of microscopic animals that eat those. And those, in turn, become the food for the larger marine organisms that are so important for protein on the planet, the fisheries and the larger marine mammals. So at Bigelow, we've taken this opportunity to really get into understanding what this microbial soup is like in the ocean. And even in a drop of seawater, we find enormous diversity of these organisms, and we're still trying to understand what they do. So we've been talking about the microscopic plants, and we tend to have a very terrestrial view of plants on our planet. We know about rainforests, and we know about savanna and grasslands, and we probably know quite a bit about horticulture in our garden. We certainly know how to grow the majority of these plants. When we get into the microscopic plants in the ocean, we can't grow more than 2%. The other 98% are sort of unculturable. We don't even know how to sustain them in the laboratory to understand the nutrients that they need and the chemicals that are important for their life, or indeed the role they play in the way the oceans cycle. Furthermore, that diversity of these microscopic organisms is huge in terms of their genetic characteristics. Many of these microbes have been here since the earliest life forms on the planet. So they've inherited a fabulous diversity of DNA and genes, and these genes function in a whole variety of ways. So at Bigelow, we're sort of developing tools and techniques to probe into the genetic machinery of these organisms, to understand how these organisms interact with each other, to form sort of an ecology of these, and then how that ecology in turn influences the planet around us. And of course, we have to search from the polar regions to the tropical regions, from the surface of the ocean right down to its deepest depths, and even into the rocks and sediments that underlie the oceans, because we find as much biomass and life living in the sediment and the rock as we do in the waters above them. So I'm just painting that sort of picture of unknown in terms of the microbial life of the ocean. Now we're going to just sort of explore that a little bit, because I'm going to come back to the way in which Colin has traveled around and met with communities who are very close to the ocean to hear some of their tales and some of the things that they're seeing happening.
Yeah, I mean, more recently in my career, in the past 10 years or so, the big thing you started noticing in the stories I was reporting overseas, I did a lot of international global science and environment and oceans reporting, and the key seemed to be the changes that were going on, especially as you went to the poles. I went to the Antarctic in the late 1990s. I was going to a place called Palmer Station, which is the U.S. research station on the Antarctic Peninsula, which is, for the Antarctic, the relatively northern area. They call it the banana belt of Antarctica because it's not -10 all the time. But this station was the station that did a lot of the biological research. And the remarkable thing was that they had the station on this little peninsula on a glaciated island. And the glacier went up in this wall of ice as far as you can see, and took an entire day to climb up it. Stunning, that kind of blue ice. Looks like the ice age hasn't ended yet because it hasn't behind the station. And you could walk out a few football fields behind the station, past some ponds and various outcroppings to get to the base of it and start climbing up. But the disturbing thing was there were photos inside Palmer Station taken every year of, Palmer Station, winter of 72. Palmer Station, winter of 73, all the people at Palmer Station standing outside the station with a glacier behind them. And you go back to 1972, and the glacier ended right behind the station, like you could practically reach out your window and touch it. And you could watch in each photo as this 10,000-year-old, thousands and thousands of feet high wall, a mountain of ice, was scrolling back behind them across the landscape at a rather rapid rate. And many of the people who were involved in glaciology had said, when I got into this field in the 70s and 80s, we were taught that, that glaciology, these are things and time frames where change does not occur in human lifetimes. And instead, we're seeing dramatic changes that we thought would take millennia take place in a few years. And at Palmer Station, you could see it. Everyone was wondering, well, is Palmer Station really on a peninsula? Or are we going to discover that we're on an island separated from the other island by a strait or some kind of passage? But it was more than that. The station was studying penguins that lived on an archipelago of little ledges outside the island, Adelie penguins, and these penguins were starting to disappear because the habitat was changing in ways that the penguins could not survive. These are the type of penguin that require cold weather and require that that the sea surface be frozen through much of the winter for their life cycle and feeding to take place, and it no longer was working. And their habitat, oddly enough, if it warms up, you start getting more moisture in the Antarctic and it snows more. It actually doesn't snow much in Antarctica until recently. And as snow and ice started forming more often, it confused the nesting penguins, who had never encountered this situation when they were nesting. And they ended up running around, instead of collecting the pebbles to make their little nests, they were going around collecting little beads of ice, not having encountered them before. And then when they would sit on them, the ice would melt and the eggs would die. So you're having failures there. And for the first time, the penguins were not evolved to deal with ticks, because the ticks would be killed in the Antarctic winter. Not anymore. The ticks would arrive in an albatross or a petrel from South America and do just fine. And so they were penguins being eaten to death by the ticks because they couldn't pick at them and they didn't know to preen each other. Not evolutionarily in place for it. Ditto for the cold water seals. And in both cases, the warm water species, the gentoo penguins and other seals, were coming into the range, and the cold water ones were rapidly disappearing. Again, the penguin scientists were like, I thought I was going to study this my whole life. We're doing a long-term ecological series for the National Science Foundation, and the ecology just disappeared. I guess we can stop that long-term series. And the data set is over. More recently, I went up to Greenland, and at the time I was in the Antarctic in the late 90s, everybody said, well, the Antarctic, is changing very slowly, but look, nothing's happening in Greenland. There's been no effects up there. And I was there in 2007, and the way of life in Greenland is being dramatically transformed. Because unlike the Antarctic, people live in the Arctic region, and Greenland has Inuit-speaking people who live all along the coast. Interesting fact, there are no roads connecting Greenlandic cities and communities because it's absolutely impossible. I mean, there's glaciers and gigantic Rocky Mountain-style mountains between every hamlet of 40 people. You couldn't possibly build and maintain a road network with those population densities and that topography. So what everybody does is they wait until winter, and then they go visit each other when the snow freezes, when the ocean freezes. They get out their sled dogs, and they have thousands of years of tradition of riding around with their sled dogs, going across the smooth, frozen sea, and visiting everybody all winter long. In the summer, you go out hunting and stuff, and you don't really see anyone from the outside community because nobody can afford to pay the helicopter flights. Only the sea isn't freezing anymore and hasn't for years to the extent where your sled dogs can run across it. Or if it does freeze, it breaks up again and forms this crazy landscape you couldn't possibly sled dog across, to the effect that everyone in northern Greenland we visited was starting to get rid of their sled dogs for good. And we're trapped with nothing to do all winter and not being able to visit anyone. Meanwhile, in the south of the country, when I reached there, they were growing broccoli for the first time. All sorts of new crops they'd never grown before, and the fjords that Leif Erikson lived on were now experimenting with brand new warm crops that they hadn't arrived yet. In other words, change that nobody had seen in many thousands of years, at least till the dawn of the Little Ice Age, was taking place once again, year to year, in a recognizable way. And these changes, of course, have knock-on effects within the oceans and the shared relationship between the interactions of the marine species and the atmosphere and the oceans themselves. I remember talking about all of this stuff when I was down in the Caribbean shortly thereafter. I was at a meeting, and I was on the island of Grenada, and the meeting included, luckily enough, going scuba diving. And we were paired up with other meeting participants rather randomly as dive partners, and kind of going out and kind of talking about, gosh, what a mess with the oceans and fisheries problems, and look at all this stuff that's happening in Arctic regions. I was chatting with this other guy, and I said, yeah, and on top of everything else, now it turns out that all of the CO2, all the carbon dioxide we're pumping into the environment is apparently changing the pH value of the oceans and pushing it closer to the further out of the base scale and towards the acid end of the scale. And I hear that it's starting to actually dissolve things like the coral reefs are going to go dive on. And while I was talking about it, I said, who threw that into the mix? And while I was talking about this, the dive partner I was talking to had this strange expression on his face. And it came out that he had been one of the biospherians who had voluntarily locked themselves in Biosphere 2. Remember that, out in the Arizona desert? They're going to create a giant dome and create a sealed-off environment from the rest of the planet. We're Biosphere 1. They're going to create their own sealed biosphere, and they're going to try to engineer a way where it could survive hermetically sealed from the outside world and support these 6 biospherians for a year or something. And he was one of them in there. Well, the thing failed, and the reason it failed is although they put a coral reefs and they put jungles and they had all this ecosystem that was hopefully going to cycle all of the biochemistry so that they could survive and they could grow their own crops and they could keep their atmosphere regulated. Well, it turns out that they were breathing and producing too much CO2. And they eventually had to abandon the biosphere because carbon dioxide was starting to cause them all to pass out and was threatening their lives. But the first indication they had that something was wrong was when this guy, who was in charge of the coral reef pool, started noticing that the coral reefs were beginning to dissolve. And he said, unfortunately, it seems that as we're building things up, this is going to happen to Biosphere 1 now. And that certainly got my attention. I mean, you look at a problem like ocean acidification. I mean, are we, from a scientific perspective, are we really heading towards that kind of outcome in Biosphere 1, where these kinds of changes will lead to a world where coral reefs can't exist? I mean, what does this mean for the ocean?
The other problem.
The other problem.
That you're talking about. So the scientists are coining this phrase, the other problem, partly because it's an invisible one in many senses, but as Colin has explained, it's rooted in the rate of change of essentially a planet that is dominated by humans and affecting all aspects of the planetary system. That carbon dioxide that is being produced because of the burning of the fossil fuels is dissolving into the ocean. And just like if you take a bottle of water and breathe into it, the carbon dioxide from our breath will actually make that water slightly more acidic. Any fizzy pop drink is slightly acidic because of the carbon dioxide that's in there. And unfortunately, there's a few other bits of chemistry that don't really work in favor of getting rid of that carbon dioxide, and that is that it dissolves more easily when the ocean water is cold. Carbon dioxide dissolves into colder water more easily than warmer water, slightly counterintuitive. But the problem with that is that the distribution of all our industry and other processes of agricultural activity is concentrated in the northern hemisphere and at mid to upper latitudes, the very places where the ocean waters are colder. So essentially, we are sinking all this CO2 that was in the atmosphere into the surface waters of the ocean. The oceans are circulating as well, so then you're distributing that dissolved carbon dioxide and making it more acid. So the problem is that many, many organisms have developed the ability to make their skeletons from chalk, from calcium carbonate. That's because there's plenty of calcium in the oceans, and there's a lot of the bicarbonate iron that's there as well, dissolved from all the rocks and minerals from the land and so on, that's washed over many billions of years into the ocean waters. And you mentioned the corals. That's probably the most obvious one. The chalk of coral reefs is clearly a major part of the ecology of the oceans. But if we just stop and think about all the things that you know that are made of calcium carbonate, so clams, oysters, lobsters use calcium carbonate. Then you think of some of the things that you might have seen, large cliffs of chalk. You know, back in Britain, we wax lyrical about the White Cliffs of Dover. White Cliffs of Dover are actually made up of the microscopic skeletons of billions and billions of a marine algae called a coccolithophore. And the cocco bit stands for the chalk, and they have tiny skeletons made of this chalk material. So many, many creatures in the ocean, both plants and animals, have evolved to take opportunity of building their skeletons from chalk. And as you know, chalk dissolves pretty readily in acid, and you don't have to have very much acidity for that to start to happen. The question from the scientific perspective is, how does that sort of start to impact on ecosystems and ecology? And indeed, how do we start to sort of make some predictions about this going forward into the future? That's some of the current work that's going on, both at Bigelow and many other marine laboratories around the world. And we're finding differences between different classes of organisms in the way they respond to that. And of course, this issue about different parts of the ocean, depending on latitude and other climatological effects. So we have started to refer to this as the other problem, the main problem being things like global warming or environmental change, but this hidden problem of really impacting on some of the most fundamental organisms that control the way in which the oceans function is a really significant challenge for us going forward into the future. So I've started to introduce a couple of other phrases in that, and one of those was ecology, thinking about the linkages between the different organisms that can sort of constitute the operation of the ocean. And I know that Colin's kind of looked at that management of ecology, just as we do on land. We have, for agricultural purposes, managed many of the plants and crops and so on for the benefit of mankind. We've sort of been doing that in the oceans to a greater and lesser extent, and to a degree of success or not. And I wonder what your perspectives have been on management of the ecology of the ocean. I
mean, my sense in covering this sort of collapse of marine systems all over the world is you do see a common theme, and it's something like, we used to, humans, the oceans are very big, and we humans are very small, and we can't possibly destroy them. And that was essentially the case for most of our history. But recently, it's turned out that we've generated the kind of powers and abilities and stresses and demands that we can no longer just take everything we want out of the oceans and put whatever we want in and not have there be noticeable and indeed dramatic effects. And unfortunately, we've kind of slow to learn these lessons. We're always behind the curve. And now we're in the situation where we've taken fish stocks and reduced them to 1/10 or sometimes 1% of their level of, say, the mid-1960s. created incredibly difficult problems where recovering those stocks gets more and more complicated, so that even our 20th century ways of trying to handle and manage our activities, those simple basic ways that aren't that hard to accomplish and execute, are no longer sufficient. I mean, it used to be you could go and say, okay, well, we want to make sure we don't take too many cod, so in this box of the ocean, you can take this many cod this year. And if it seems like the cod are having trouble, we'll take a little less next year. Oh, and oops, we just wiped out the cod entirely. Well, you won't fish any cod right now, but then some guys over in the next room, over at Fishery Management Headquarters, are deciding completely separately, without reference to that problem, how many of the, say, capelin that the cod of the Grand Banks of Newfoundland eat will be allowed to be taken away by Soviet factory freezer trawlers that year. And the answer is, well, look, what do you know? There's suddenly this enormous explosion of this capelin, as if nobody's eating them. Well, we can't let them go to waste. We'll let the Soviets come in and take 10 times their previous quota. And lo and behold, the cod don't recover because there's no food for them. That predator-prey relationship. Suddenly, all of these things matter, and down to a extremely daunting level of resolution. Now, we've messed up badly enough in many ways that in order to manage our activities, because we've pushed things, the margin of error down to a very tight degree, I think we have to actually understand how the oceans work to a rather frightening degree. We need to understand how these organisms interact with one another and with their habitat so that we don't mess things up, so that there'll be as many, or hopefully more and more of them in future, to provide for the growing needs of humanity, because there's a lot of us. When I was born, there were 3 billion of us, and now there's what, 7? And by 2050, there's supposed to be 10? I mean, that's a lot of people. And there's only so much land. We're going to need this stuff in the oceans, just at the time where we've been wiping them out. So how would we, it's called ecosystem-based management, but the basic idea is to try to understand well enough the basics of how a given marine ecosystem works so that we know what the important parts are and don't ruin those, and try to identify them. As one scientist I talked to put it, it's an airplane. The Gulf of Maine is an airplane, and it has a lot of rivets. You can pull one or two out, and there'll be no effect, but you need to know which rivets you can't pull out. And that's kind of the quest now. And I know it's being done in the Gulf of Maine, through the Census Marine Life program, and I went out with some of the scientists who've been working on that, one of whom happened to be at Bigelow, and Lou Insay from University of Southern Maine, out to Platts Bank, where they're doing some of this research, where they're trying to understand why it is that this particular bank, that whales show up there to feed, and suddenly everything happens. There's birds, and there's fish, and there's whales, and everything's having a feast, and then one day everyone goes home. Why is that? And what are the critical times to protect this area? And how does that feed into the broader interactions of the system? We're just starting to learn all these things, but it's a daunting amount to learn. And I guess, one of my questions is, how can science learn and pick up some of this information? Do you think it's possible to better handle our relationship with ecosystems so that we interact with them in sustainable ways?
Yeah, well, clearly we need to be able to do that. The trouble is that the system is interrelated. As you've talked about the rivets in the aeroplane or the cogs in the wheel, the interaction between these things is so important. So whilst we might have a rather simple concept of a food chain, starting with a microscopic plant and then a smaller marine animal, and then that turns to the food for a slightly larger fish and then an even bigger fish, and we kind of think of it in a sort of simplistic sense like that. When we go to the next level, we've got to think about how the physics of the circulation of that ocean affects it. How things like the light penetration, which is important for growing the microscopic plants, how that has changed. We might need to think of the impact of the coastal environment, like the example of the Danube flowing into the Black Sea. And then, of course, the human activities, the way in which we manage that. So these all sort of come together. The approach for the scientists, of course, is to be a reductionist approach. You've probably heard that kind of phrase, breaking things down into the individual parts, trying to understand how the pieces mesh together and how, with steady but repetitive work, we can build a picture with some degree of certainty. So Bigelow scientists and others have picked parts of the world's oceans where we might want to take that approach. We have actually been doing that in the Gulf of Maine. It's an ideal place to understand these interactions between the currents and the circulation and the primary food, together with the inputs that come from the surrounding landmass. And one of the ways that you can do this is to keep going back to the same patch of ocean repeatedly, time after time, making relatively simple measurements, but building up a picture of how each year, year on year, starts to change. We've been doing that. Barney Balch, one of the scientists at Bigelow Laboratory, for nearly 13, 14 years now, has been running backwards and forwards across the Gulf of Maine, making many of the measurements that I've been talking about. And one of the interesting things that happens when you just look at, just over a decade, it's not a very long time in the time span of oceans, and certainly humans can affect things, have affected things over longer time periods. But one of the important things that you see is that the system doesn't just slowly trend to another state, it kind of switches. And this concept of a tipping point, a point when something suddenly changes, is extraordinarily difficult to model and predict. And it only comes about when you have a whole variety of data being gathered at the same time. Interestingly, in the Gulf of Maine, that sort of tipping point seems to occur when the precipitation, the rainfall and the wetter summers that we'd had for about 5 years, from 2007 to 2012, that time period, that wetter time period, coincided with some quite rapid changes in the primary production in the Gulf of Maine. Of course, that primary production, that's the initial food stock for many of the larger animals which we depend on. How quickly that passes through the food chain, we still don't know. Actually, in this last year, it's gone drier again. So we've got a cycle going on. So we've got tipping points, and we've got cycles, and we've got physics interacting with biology. So it's very complex, but the opportunities of new technologies, new equipment to start doing this more routinely and sending information back through satellites is the way we can start to build pictures about these changes that Colin has talked about. So I think, one of the other aspects of talking about change is to gain a historical perspective, looking back into time, when we can sort of see how the oceans might have been before we started to do too many things to it. And again, you sort of had an opportunity to see some of that.
Right, what's normal, right?
Yeah, what's normal,
if we're
exactly.
going to do all this ecosystem stuff, what's the benchmark,
Yeah.
right? When do we say, yeah, we did it, we met the mark? I mean, is it, I mentioned that, in the Grand Banks and Georges Banks, a lot of fisheries have fallen to, 1%, 10%, 30% of their level of the 1960s. But is that the real normal level we should be marking for? Because the disturbing thing is, if you go back into the historical archives, you even read, you don't even have to go back to the 1600s when you had, early explorers talking about their ships running aground on shoals of fish, and putting baskets over the ship's side and pulling up, basketfuls of cod and, everywhere they went. Just go, to the 19th century, where we have published records and official records from the U.S. Fish Commission, and all the letters that fishermen throughout New England were writing in the 1850s to the U.S. Fish Commission, and they're writing letters where they said, one letter after another, they publish them. They're down at the Portland Public Library if you pull out the right volumes in the government reading room. All these fishermen writing in, well, I've been fishing since I was a kid, and let me tell you, these new steam trawlers pulling these little wooden trawls absolutely have destroyed the fishery. The fish used to be, enormous, and now they're a tiny, tiny percentage of their original size, and the young people don't even realize that there's a tenth of the fish there used to be, and they're all tiny fish, and we've completely ruined the fishery in 1850. And you read the next generation, their kids in 1870, writing in the same thing. When I was a kid in the 1850s, the fish were great, and now they're a tiny fraction of what they used to be. In other words, each generation thinks that what they started with was normal and doesn't quite realize, perhaps, that the baseline of what we consider normal has been shifting over time because our lifetimes are rather short and these processes are rather long. And it's only recently that people involved in the field of forensic fisheries research, sort of historians meet fisheries research, have started digging back into records and digging, using archaeology and other ways to start reconstructing what the fishery used to look like. And it makes for frightening reading, usually. One of my favorite examples is this project HMAP, historical mapping. A team out of the University of New Hampshire found records, old customs records, for the Blue Hill, Maine Customs District. And there were two sets of records that essentially allowed them, when they put them together, to reconstruct how many fish were being caught and exactly what size they were. And it's such that the fishermen, due to the incentive structure, had no reason to cheat one way or the other the way the records were kept. And this was for just the Blue Hill Customs District, which was basically that big peninsula that takes you from, Castine over to Brooklyn and down, including Stonington and stuff. Just the fishermen in that one little chunk of western Hancock County. And the results, when they finally worked it out, is that these fishermen, who were all inshore fishermen, working from open boats within sight of land, using hand lines with baited hooks and having to pull each individual fish up with a hand line and baited hook and then sail back home, were catching significantly more fish each year in the 1860s than all of the fishermen in the Gulf of Maine with all of our fish finders and trawlers and everything else are today, just in that one customs district. Which of course leads people to ask, what were those fish eating? And remember, this is an inshore cod fishery. This fishery doesn't exist anymore. It was eliminated finally in the 1950s through pulse fishing on spawning fish aggregations. It's a non-existent resource that then was equivalent to the kind of commercial fish resources that you were obtaining throughout the entire Gulf of Maine region. Pretty stunning stuff. So I mean, what does that mean when you have those kind of time series differences and those kind of serious things going on like that? I mean, can science help us with the policy questions when it seems like the speed at which these changes are happening compared to the speed with which you can do that reductive science approach? How do you bridge that difference in the rapidity and drama of the problem and the time it takes to tease out these long time series and patterns that we talk about? It seems like a difficult conundrum.
It is, and I think science is often accused of not coming up with an answer. Science is usually trying to evaluate the balance of probability. Given a set of circumstances, what is the more likely outcome? But I think with the challenge of the oceans has come the time for the science to really step forward a bit and say, well, actually, we do have some knowledge, we do have some tools and techniques, and we have the benefit of hindsight. So let's now start to apply this in a slightly different way going forward. This is the concept of using the informed approach or even the precautionary principle in terms of trying to set better policies for the future of the oceans for future generations. And to give you one example of how this is moving, just in the last week, I was in Germany working with the International Union for the Conservation of Nature for one very specific scientific application that is becoming a new opportunity. And that is the genetic resources that occur in particularly the microbial populations of the world's oceans, and not in the coastal zones of each individual nation state that we've been talking about, like in the Gulf of Maine, but out there in the wide open ocean, what's called the areas beyond national jurisdiction. These are the parts of the ocean which are essentially the commons for all mankind. It's where there is unregulated fisheries taking place. But there is also this new science of the genetic resources there. And how do we, as an international population, bring together the science and a management for an area that is there for all mankind in a more sensible fashion? And organizations like the United Nations and many of the non-governmental organizations are turning their attention to this because they realize that our science is moving so fast now that we do need to be able to address these issues, as well as things like the fisheries and so on that we've just been talking about. So I am an optimist that science, and particularly the newer generations of scientists who are much more engaged with societal issues, will help us find a way forward. It does require scientists to be more articulate, to work with the policymakers, the people making the decisions, to help advise and inform the public through events like these, and generally raise the level of debate and discussion so that we can all share in a common resource, which is the world's oceans. And I am absolutely convinced that, you know, with a growing planet, like you said, we all need protein, we all need clean water, we all need to be able to manage the products of our industrial age. And really, the only solution is going to come from us all working together. So I think with that, Colin, we're going to try and take a few questions from people. And so the way we're going to do this is we have a microphone. It would be great if you can use the microphone, because then other people will hear you. We'll see how that goes. If we find that that's too difficult, the person can just shout out the question from where they are. We'll repeat it so that everyone can hear. Yes, sir, in the middle, halfway back. I'll tell you what, well, it's going to be hard getting up. Why don't you speak, and I'll repeat the question, and then we'll see. Thank you, sir. So the question is really, is that the rate of the change, like I was just explaining, is so fast, and whether or not science can actually manage that, and maybe there is another approach where communication, meeting with science can help address that. So I'm going to turn to the...
Yeah. I mean, that's a tricky question. I mean, journalism can only move, I suppose, on the scientific questions at the rate of the scientists, and that our job is to assemble the narratives and the story of what is going on and convey it to people in a accurate and hopefully, you know, useful fashion. You know, digesting and refining all the vast amount of information around us. But the raw material is probably going to have to come from the science sphere. I guess what journalism can do as a feedback mechanism is being able to identify some of the emerging problems out there and disseminate that information, which science will then be grappling with as well. But, you know, it is a nexus, but there's no way to kind of make the research happen faster, I don't think. I mean, maybe, I think the real question is maybe the triangle of the policy realm, science, and journalism, because the feedback from the policy realm is grant funding and, you know, what we're going to invest in and try to learn about, which oftentimes is a public investment, into the science sphere, that in what decision makers and legislators and our representatives who control the budget make their decisions based on stuff that they learn from the press and journalism. So I think that's the most important axis, is that the decision makers trying to decide how best to guide society's resources, decide to invest them, and hopefully if you have good journalism out there, you're going to have some ability to help provide the information and identify some of those things that are going on.
There is one other aspect that's really critical to understand, and that is the nature of the validation of the scientific result. We call it the peer review process. Science being performed through the internet and then being used in a journalistic sense is not going to help serve society for some of the questions we've talked about. And so we do need to have those checks and balances to ensure that the quality of what's reported and how it's being used is being done in the most appropriate fashion. And I think, as Colin said, it is the interaction between the media, the policymaker, and the scientist understanding each other in a more effective way that will help us going forward.
And there's also that, you know, when science comes up, with a very important piece of information, it's sometimes hard to get the policy side to grapple with the implications of it. Or maybe they don't want to grapple with the implications because it's a really bad no-win solution. And some of that is also the sort of pressure that watchdog journalism can bring to bear on those kind of things.
Yes, yes, ma'am, yes.
I'm just curious, at Bigelow Labs, do you have a policy arm, and how does that veer into advocacy? Is it pretty much just the science happening there, and then you're relying on journalists to get the word out, or do you have people that are trying to inform what the policy should be and then push them out?
Great. So the question is, at Bigelow, do we have a policy arm for doing advocacy? The short answer is no. We have a communications office to ensure that the science that we're performing is being delivered in the whole variety of ways to the media in a timely and digestible fashion. But transferring that science into policy is not part of the mission of the laboratory. However, I think scientists can play a role through non-governmental and organizations that use best knowledge and best practice to help channel that towards the policymakers. And many of us at Bigelow are involved in that both at a national and an international level. So it's using kind of best knowledge, best practice, as opposed to the actual decision making. And over the next year, I'm going to encourage scientists at Bigelow to start doing that also here in the state of Maine, as well as internationally. It's very important. There's one question at the back, and then this gentleman. Yes, please.
On completing Ocean's End, the first thing I did was try to figure out what might have happened in the interim with the Black Sea. Do you have an update?
Yeah, for Ocean's End's readers, generally there's good news from the Black Sea in that one of the biggest stressors upon the system was all of that nutrient pollution coming down. And one of the benefits of the collapse of the Soviet system is all of those fertilizer inputs stopped flowing to the region, and the European Union's common agricultural policy, guided by the good people of France to protect French farming, wanted to make sure that none of those gigantic state farms in Eastern Europe were allowed to compete within the European Union with the French farmers, and therefore essentially all subsidies of Hungary and all these other countries into that sector were removed, causing the entire agricultural sector to collapse. That was a great human tragedy, but for the Danube River, it resulted in a sudden decline in fertilizer inputs. Secondly, World Bank and the European Union realized that it was going to be absorbing all of these countries, and that all of their problems would suddenly become the EU's problems. And so as they were headed towards membership, the European Union pressured the World Bank to make sure that when they gave Hungary a $10 quadrillion structural adjustment loan, that they added in 50 cents to build some new water treatment plants. So essentially, the World Bank, prompted and kicked by the European Union for its own interests, managed to get sewage treatment plants installed in major cities. So an unusual historical moment, the dramatic collapse of communism, allowed an opportunity and an incentive for an incredible and staggering amount of investment in infrastructure and a piece of, I would call it benign neglect, but a neglect of the agricultural sector that caused the primary driver to disappear. The algal blooms started disappearing as well, and another passing ship introduced another species that ended up going around eating up the comb jelly. And the word is out there that there's sort of a slow rebuilding of the Black Sea ecosystem because of those historic factors. So fortunate in that respect.
Thanks, Colin. There's one here and then one.
I was interested in the measurements that you were talking about that Bigelow has been doing over the past 15 years in developing Maine, and you talked about the impact of increased runoff. And I was wondering what you've been seeing in terms of warming ocean temperatures and acidification.
So the question was about the fact that we have been studying the Gulf of Maine over the last 15 years, but can we see other trends in terms of ocean temperature and ocean acidification? The short answer is yes, there are trends everywhere. Of course, the trends are not of the same magnitude, and sometimes they're not even in the same direction, depending on the location. So it would be, other than getting very specific over areas, it would be difficult to tell. But there are some very broad-scale interpretations that we see, particularly if we study something that is the product of many things coming together. such as the polar ice in the Arctic. That's a sea ice that is very sensitive to changes in ocean currents, circulation, precipitation, and that extent of particularly the summer sea ice is dramatically shrinking over the last 5 to 10 years. In fact, this summer was the smallest extent of summer sea ice that's ever been recorded in the Arctic. And as you're probably aware, it probably won't be too long before a summer transit right through the polar waters will be possible. In other parts of the world, we see other kinds of effects taking place, particularly around the growth of phytoplankton and eutrophication, the expansion of areas of the ocean where there's no oxygen. We call them dead zones. In the Gulf of Mexico, the discharge from the Mississippi River tends to lead to depletions of oxygen in the water, and those things have been changing in their size and magnitude. So we tend to focus on the product because it integrates many different types of these factors together, rather than just take single temperature readings in different places. If we take one at the back. Yes, the lady on the right, thank you.
Colin, what you described in 1989 in Hungary and collapse of the Soviet Union is very similar to what's happening in China now, and just incredible pollution of rivers and the ocean there. And just curious what type of impact you're seeing in South China Sea, the Pacific Ocean,
Yeah.
based on what's going on with China and the pollution there.
I've actually never visited China. I've only gotten as close as South Korea. I've read from afar, as you all have. I mean, it's a rapidly industrializing country with over 1 billion people. And yeah, that's going to have all sorts of effects. And you know, my general impression as a non-expert from the outside is that China's leadership realizes that these are things that could bring down their economy as well, and are starting to try to make investments that will maybe head off some of the worst air pollution and water pollution issues. But I can't offer any direct expertise because that's one part of the globe I've missed in my globetrotting.
Right, we are going to take 2 final questions. There's one here on the left and one at the back, and then we're going to break, and there'll be an opportunity to talk with us at the reception afterwards. Joe.
Just to try to bring it home a little bit and narrow the topic to food, the protein gap, your 10 million people, 10 billion people. What do you see as sustainable aquaculture, land-based, open ocean, even stuff that sounds like sustainable aquaculture? You still eat these things.
Right.
What's the answer? And do we just eat them all algae and grow algae?
Do you want to have a crack at that first from your perspective, or would you? I'll come from a science perspective.
You know, as my general sense in covering aquaculture, I mean, it seems to me that in the ideal scenario, that we would have the ecosystems producing wild fish in the quantities they ought to be, and then we wouldn't be down this road. We're down this road, so we end up with less perfect solutions. And yeah, you know, what you grow is going to be kind of key to it. Yeah, I think open ocean, if you're going to grow cod, if you're going to grow a carnivorous fish species, right, that eats other fish, it's going to need to, you know, eat fish protein and stuff, and you're probably going to want to avoid being in a situation where you're scooping up wild-caught fish and converting them through carnivorous fish into food protein, because that's not a very efficient way to go about it. There's a reason we don't, you know, raise tigers on land for meat, is because you'd have to feed them so much meat it would be a net loss. So, you know, the species you use are key. The when you get down to filter feeders like you know, mollusks and oysters, I think everyone's in. I don't think there's very many people out there saying, no, don't oyster farm. That would, you know, that cleans up the water, and you know, so there's a spectrum of aquaculture that I think everyone thinks is a good and makes an awful lot of sense, to areas that are problematic and would require more technical solutions and understanding to feel fully confident in. Is it possible to do that? Yes. Is it going to be a better solution for a given species than rebuilding an ecosystem? I don't know. My inclination is that the ecosystem can probably produce more and more effectively if it's operating right. And I hope that that's, in general, on the planet, as a general proposition, is the direction we'll succeed in going. Because, you know, I think it just makes logical sense that that's the way things would work best and produce the most. But you know, as a stopgap or an imperfect solution, yeah. That, you know, as to a particular species in a particular place, you know, I'd have to do reporting on that to give you a solid answer. But those are my general sense.
Thank you. And one right at the back, final question. it's obvious it's so difficult to do, isn't it? I mean, in one...
Yeah.
No.
Our policymakers say there's still a lot of basic science questions, I think that.
Right. So I think one challenge has been to convert into concepts that resonate right across the political spectrum and across society. So for instance, how do we value the environment, whether that's in dollars or whether it's in amenity value or even in sheer aesthetics? And we need to establish some of these common parameters by which we can have a discussion. There's a lot of the meeting between the hard science and the social sciences to try and identify these common threads of valuing the ecology and the environmental conditions so that we can start to introduce that in a proper way in some of the decision making that's available. So that is one route. It's a rather arcane kind of study in one sense, but it is important that we get to a common language. I think the second part is to actually start to introduce the enthusiasm into science and how science can be a part of underpinning society and really trying to do the best for the next generations. And that's the bit that I think the media can particularly help us with. Instead of reporting too many of the bad news stories, let's try to find some of the other positive stories that come from that and try and encourage next generation. So that's a rather simplistic answer to a very complex question.
I agree with that. I guess my working in the journalism profession, I writing Ocean's End, you figure if people just knew what was actually going on, then obviously we'd make the rational conclusions from that. And it's not always the case, and I think my biggest concern is, yes, there's a set of people and decision makers who will in fact respond to actual information that's out there, but the growing rise of the sort of anti-science, let's throw out the Enlightenment traditions, and it doesn't matter what the facts say, I will just invent my own facts. The fact that now pervades decision makers at the highest levels of power in government is distressing for one of the most powerful countries on earth that everybody depends on. So that's my big concern, is that is rather impervious to the normal cycle of fact-based information. Now, what one does about that, I'm not certain, but it's a big problem for solving some of these problems and bringing forth the implications of what's being discovered scientifically.
And I think that's a perfect note to where we can adjourn to the reception outside. So thank you very much indeed.